People often accuse others of the traps they have built for themselves. The Moretti estate was a sprawling monument to suspicion, built from cold Rhode Island granite. From the panoramic windows of the master bedroom, the misty cliffs of Newport looked less like a breathtaking view and more like the edge of the earth. Inside, the temperature always felt a few degrees too low. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, perfectly polished and utterly silent. Clara Vance knelt on the edge of a Persian rug, surrounded by the only things she truly owned. She did not pack her bags in anger. She packed them in the absolute silence of a realization. For 8 years, she had existed as a quiet background detail in his grand public life, ensuring his comfort while he ignored her presence. Now, her movements were measured, deliberate, and entirely calm. Sylvia Finch stood near the heavy oak doorway, holding a stack of freshly laundered cashmere sweaters. The housekeeper had been with Damon Moretti's family for decades, possessing an observant gaze that missed nothing. Sylvia watched as Clara bypassed the velvet-lined jewelry boxes holding diamond necklaces, reaching instead for a worn cardboard box tucked into the back of her closet. Clara carefully lifted out a stack of her grandmother's botanical drawings. The paper was yellowed at the edges, carrying the faint, comforting scent of dried lavender and old ink. She traced her fingers over the delicate lines of a sketched fern, her posture remaining perfectly upright. Her heavy platinum band caught the gray afternoon light, feeling colder against her skin than usual. "Shall I fold the cashmere for the travel trunks, ma'am?" Sylvia asked, her voice dropping into a careful whisper. The older woman knew exactly what was happening. She had seen the gradual collapse of the marriage measured in missing morning coffees, untouched dinners, and the increasing silence between the master and his wife. "No, Sylvia," Clara answered softly. "Just the gray wool coat, please. Leave the rest." Sylvia hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the open vault built into the mahogany wall. The Moretti diamonds sat untouched. He will notice the empty shelves eventually. "He will notice the inconvenience of an empty house," Clara corrected gently, sliding the sketches into a protective leather portfolio. "He will not notice what is actually missing." Clara wiped a speck of dust from the glass frame of another drawing, prioritizing the fragile, hand-drawn history of her family over the inherited wealth of his. Damon believed everything in the world could be bought or negotiated. He treated his marriage like a corporate merger, offering his name while consistently withholding his presence. She did not hate him. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already ended. The platinum band on her left hand was simply a placeholder now, a quiet metallic loop, waiting for the proper legal moment to be removed. Clara folded the leather portfolio and placed it at the bottom of her single suitcase. 2 weeks earlier, the sterile, brightly lit office of Dr. Marcus Harris felt completely disconnected from the looming stone walls of the Moretti estate. The private clinic catered exclusively to the city's elite, maintaining flawless medical records and absolute confidentiality. Rain slid down the panoramic glass window, blurring the skyline into a wash of gray. Clara sat on the edge of the leather examination chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, her posture straight, and her expression unreadable. Dr. Harris sat across from her behind a sleek glass desk. He was a precise, clinical man who never offered unsolicited advice. He slid a thick manila folder across the smooth surface. "The results are confirmed, Clara," Dr. Harris said, his tone professional and measured. He opened the folder, revealing a black and white printout. "You are exactly 8 weeks along. The pregnancy is viable and progressing normally. Most women her position, married to one of the most powerful and heavily guarded men on the East Coast, would have wept with joy. They would have seen this child as the ultimate anchor, a permanent guarantee of wealth and protection within the formidable Moretti hierarchy." Clara did not smile. She did not cry. Instead, she reached across the desk and picked up the ultrasound file. Her eyes bypassed the grainy image of the fetus and immediately locked on to the top right corner of the document. She stared at the black ink of the clinical timestamp, verifying the exact dating of conception. 8 weeks. She took a slow, steady breath, the sound barely registering in the quiet office. She calculated the timeline in her head, mapping the weeks against the documents already locked inside her relocation folder in her private drawer at home. The lease for the coastal cottage in Maine had been finalized long before this appointment. Her divorce petition, meticulously drafted and signed by her lawyer, bore a date that predated this moment by weeks. "Is everything all right, Clara?" Dr. Eris asked, noticing the prolonged silence. "The dating is accurate?" she asked softly, her voice steady. "Down to the day," he confirmed, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. "I have included the official stamp and my signature for your records. Thank you, Dr. Eris." Clara closed the ultrasound file, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of the heavy paper. This child was not a chain to hold her in Damon's world. It was the final undeniable reason she had to leave it. She would not allow her child to grow up inside a glass castle where love was treated as a transaction and presence was constantly postponed. She slipped the ultrasound file into her leather tote bag. The quiet click of the magnetic clasp echoed with a sense of absolute finality. Clara stood up, her movements composed and elegant, stepping back out into the cold autumn rain to finish dismantling her life. 6 weeks earlier, the air inside the Municipal Botanical Conservatory had felt entirely different from the sterile, climate-controlled perfection of the Moretti estate. It was thick, earthy, and unapologetically warm. Condensation blurred the massive glass walls, softening the sharp edges of the city outside into dull gray smears. Clara sat on a wrought iron bench beneath the heavy fronds of a mature fern, the humidity dampening the collar of her wool coat. She did not mind the heat. It felt like breathing again, unconstrained by the frigid expectations of her daily life. Footsteps echoed softly against the damp terracotta tiles. Elena appeared from the orchid aisle, her sensible trenchcoat stark against the vibrant, overgrown greenery. She carried 2 paper cups of black coffee and a thick, cream-colored relocation folder tucked tightly under her arm. She handed her sister a cup without a word. They had long passed the point of needing small talk to fill the quiet spaces between them. Clara took a slow sip. The coffee was bitter and scalding, a harsh, ordinary comfort that grounded her wandering thoughts. Elena placed the folder onto the small circular table between them. She smoothed the cover with her palm before opening it. Inside lay the lease agreement for a modest coastal cottage in Maine, alongside the finalized divorce petition her lawyer had drafted earlier that month. The stark black type on the pristine white pages felt heavier than the marble statues in Damon's grand foyer. It represented a quiet dismantling of everything she had endured for the past 7 years. "The landlord needs the final signature today," Elena said. Her voice kept deliberately low. "The deposit cleared yesterday morning. Once you sign this, the cottage is yours for the next 2 years. The utilities are already transferred under your maiden name." Clara looked down at the documents. For a long time, she had believed that leaving a marriage would require a cataclysmic event, a shattered vase, a screaming match in the driveway, a public collapse. Instead, it only required an ink signature on page 4. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a heavy gold-nibbed fountain pen. Damon had gifted it to her on their 2nd anniversary, an elegant, ostentatious tool meant for signing charity checks and foundation grants. It was designed to build the Moretti empire, not to dismantle it. The woman uncapped the pen. The gold gleamed under the filtered sunlight, piercing the glass canopy above. She pressed the nib to the thick paper. The ink flowed smoothly, black and final, binding her to a quiet address she had never seen, hundreds of miles away from the cold cliffs of Rhode Island. Elena watched the signature dry. She did not offer pity, nor did she ask if her sister was absolutely sure. She simply closed the folder, the soft snap of the cardboard echoing like a locking door. "I will have the car waiting on Thursday," Elena said, sliding the documents back into her leather tote. Clara nodded slowly. She screwed the cap back onto the pen. The transaction was complete. The cage had already been unlocked. The bird was simply waiting for the fog to lift before it flew. 40 miles away, dusk settled over the Moretti mansion like a heavy velvet shroud. The wrought iron gates groaned inward, allowing Damon's black sedan to glide up the sweeping circular driveway. The house stood immaculate against the darkening sky, its limestone facade gleaming under the strategic landscape lighting. Yet, as he stepped out of the vehicle and handed the keys to his security detail, the property felt strangely hollow. He pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. Usually, the vast foyer greeted him with a specific, curated warmth. The scent of cedarwood, white lilies, and the faint, lingering note of Clara's bergamot perfume would soften the imposing architecture. Tonight, The air smelled only of industrial floor wax and cold stone. No warm light spilled from the library doorway. No quiet classical music drifted through the corridors to mask the absolute silence. Damon removed his overcoat, expecting the quiet rustle of silk or the measured rhythm of footsteps approaching from the west wing. Silence answered him. He walked toward the drawing room, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble. The house had memorized its schedule, but forgotten its heart. He paused at the edge of the formal dining room. The long table was bare. The silver tea service, which his wife always left warming on the sideboard for his late arrivals, was absent. There was no porcelain cup, no small plate of lemon slices, no steam rising in the dim light. Even the fine silver spoons had been cleared away. The sideboard was merely a flat expanse of polished mahogany, reflecting the cold chandelier above. It looked as though nobody lived there at all. A quiet clearing of a throat made him turn. Sylvia stood near the hallway arch, her hands folded neatly over her apron. "Is Clara resting?" Damon asked. His tone was not one of concern, but of administrative inquiry. He adjusted his platinum cufflink, annoyed by the disruption of his evening routine. "Mrs. Moretti has retired to her rooms, sir," the housekeeper replied evenly. Her eyes remained fixed on a spot just past his shoulder. She requested not to be disturbed. She did not ask for the tea service to be prepared tonight. The man frowned. He did not ask why. He simply assumed it was a passing mood, a silent protest over some missed dinner or forgotten social obligation. He turned back toward the grand staircase, fully intending to head to his own separate study to review the evening's shipping manifests. As he approached the carved wooden banister, his gaze dropped to the entryway bench. Beneath it, Clara's indoor slippers had been placed side by side. They were perfectly aligned, the soft gray wool tucked neatly against the baseboard. She always wore them until the very moment she stepped into bed. Finding them abandoned here, so deliberately placed by the front door, felt entirely wrong. They looked less like discarded footwear and more like a silent notification. He stared at the small gray slippers for a long moment. A strange, unnameable irritation prickled at the back of his neck. It was not anger. It was the sudden, unsettling realization that a piece of his perfectly constructed world had shifted out of place, and he had absolutely no idea how to put it back. Damon turned his back on the empty foyer and climbed the stairs alone. Trust is often a casualty of survival, but in Damon's world, it was simply a liability he refused to carry. The sprawling Moretti estate was meticulously organized, a fortress of cold marble and controlled schedules. Yet on this particular Thursday evening, an administrative friction disrupted his routine. A secondary ledger, a record of the family's philanthropic endowments that Clara usually updated before the end of the month, was missing from his home office. In a marriage defined by invisible labor and flawless execution, the absence of a single document felt like a jarring note in an otherwise perfect symphony. Annoyed by the rare inconvenience, Damon crossed the long-shadowed hallway toward her private sitting room, a space he rarely entered unless duty required it. The room smelled faintly of cedar and cold rain, entirely devoid of the heavy cigar smoke and ambition that characterized his own spaces. He approached her antique writing desk, its polished surface bare except for a single glass paperweight. Pulling open the top drawer, he expected to find the missing leather-bound ledger neatly aligned with her fountain pens. Instead, his fingers brushed against a stiff, unsealed envelope bearing the embossed crest of a private medical facility. Damon pulled the heavy stock paper into the dim light. The name printed at the top of the crisp header belonged to Dr. Marcus Aris, a specialist known for absolute discretion among the city's elite. Beneath the letterhead lay a glossy, rectangular printout, an ultrasound file. For an ordinary man, discovering such an image in his wife's drawer would trigger a sudden, overwhelming wave of joy, confusion, or perhaps a rush of protective warmth. But Damon Moretti was not an ordinary man. He was the architect of a deeply cynical empire, a man trained since childhood to view every human interaction as a negotiation and every unexpected variable as a potential threat. He did not look at the blurred black and white curve on the glossy paper and see a child. He saw leverage. He slowly traced his thumb over the clinical seal pressed into the corner of the paper, his jaw tightening as a cold, defensive suspicion flooded his chest. In his world, women often used bloodlines to anchor themselves to power, transforming a fragile marital connection into an unbreakable generational contract. Clara had been incredibly quiet lately, withdrawn, distant, her presence in the house feeling more like a shadow than a wife. He had assumed her silence was a temporary sulk over his endless business travels and missed dinners. Now, standing in the quiet chill of her room, he reinterpreted her stillness entirely. To his paranoid mind, she had not been withdrawing at all. She had been securing her position. The child, he concluded, was her ultimate insurance policy, a calculated maneuver to ensure that no matter how cold their marriage became, she would never be removed from the Moretti name. Anger, sharp and deeply arrogant, settled into his bones as he gripped the ultrasound file, entirely blind to the profound emptiness of his own assumptions. The heavy mahogany door of Damon's primary study remained slightly ajar, allowing a thin slice of hallway light to pierce the dark, cavernous room. He did not bother turning on the brass lamps. He preferred the shadows, sitting behind his massive desk like a judge, awaiting a defendant, the ultrasound file placed dead center on the polished wood. The room smelled of old leather, expensive bourbon, and the faint, bitter ash of a cold fireplace. It was an environment designed entirely for intimidation, a space where men twice his age had broken under the weight of his silence. He waited, letting the minutes stretch, listening to the muffled rhythm of rain tapping against the tall, iron-framed windows. Eventually, the soft, measured click of heels echoed against the marble floor of the corridor. The door pushed open wider. Clara stepped over the threshold, bringing with her the scent of damp autumn air and the quiet composure she always wore like armor. She paused just inside the room, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. Her gaze drifted over the unlit lamps, the oppressive atmosphere, and finally settled on the man waiting in the dark. As she approached the desk, the ambient light caught the glossy surface of the medical printout resting in front of his steepled fingers. Damon watched her face, his eyes narrowed, waiting for the inevitable reaction. He expected a sudden gasp, a defensive stutter, or perhaps the immediate tearful performance of a woman caught springing a strategic trap. He braced himself for a loud, emotional justification. Clara did none of those things. Her expression did not fracture. Her breathing did not hitch. She looked down at the ultrasound file, then slowly raised her clear, unreadable eyes to meet his intense stare. The silence in the room grew heavy, nearly suffocating, pressing against the mahogany walls, but she did not rush to fill it with excuses. Instead, Clara raised her hands and began to remove her black leather outdoor gloves. The gesture was deliberate, excruciatingly slow. She pulled the leather from her left hand, smoothing the material flat, and laid it quietly on the edge of his desk. She repeated the motion with her right hand, setting the second glove perfectly parallel to the first. The soft friction of the leather against the wood was the only sound in the cavernous room. It was a battle of absolute composure, and Damon found himself momentarily unnerved by her total lack of panic. Anger was loud, manipulation was loud. Her profound calm felt entirely foreign to the accusation burning in his mind. She stood on the opposite side of the desk, perfectly still, offering no defense, no apology, and no explanation, leaving his dark suspicions to hang awkwardly in the cold, silent air between them. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Damon Moretti did not raise his voice. He never did. In the world he commanded, anger was loud and undisciplined, but true power was a whisper. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the expansive surface of the mahogany desk. Beneath his tailored cuff, a silver watch caught the pale glow of the single desk lamp. Between his fingers, the Mafia boss held the ultrasound file. He tapped the thick paper against the wood, producing a rhythmic, hollow sound that seemed to count down the final seconds of their marriage. He laid out his accusation with the cold, methodical precision of a man dissecting a hostile corporate takeover bid. He did not speak of a broken heart. The executive spoke of leverage, of assets, of calculated risks. He wove a narrative of a woman who had meticulously evaluated her declining value within his estate. He painted a picture of Clara, sensing the growing emotional void between them, understanding that her status in the hierarchy was completely dependent on his tolerance, and deciding to manufacture a biological anchor before he could dismiss her. "A child," Damon said softly, his tone flat and devoid of any warmth. "A Moretti heir. It is the oldest, most transparent strategy in the world. I must admit, I am almost impressed by the sheer pragmatism of it." You felt the foundation cracking. You knew that my patience for this arrangement was finite, so, rather than accept a quiet separation, you decided to secure a permanent, irrevocable position. He looked down at the clinical black-and-white image provided by Dr. Eris, treating the evidence of a heartbeat not as a miracle, but as a forged signature on a binding contract. He systematically listed the dividends of her supposed trap. He spoke of the untouchable protection granted to the mother of his lineage, the guaranteed access to the family trust, and the social insulation from the whispering wives at the charity galas. He articulated the imagined scheme with an air of arrogant certainty, perfectly convinced that his flawless logic had exposed her. The cruelty of his accusation was not in any physical threat. It lay entirely in the sterile erasure of her humanity. The man sitting behind the desk was reducing every quiet cup of coffee she had ever poured, every silent evening she had spent waiting up for him, and every ounce of invisible labor into the actions of a patient, calculating parasite. He stared at his wife across the desk, his dark eyes locked onto hers, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He expected tears. He expected a frantic, trembling defense, or the panicked pleading of a woman whose ultimate leverage had just been neutralized. Clara Vance stood perfectly still near the center of the heavy Persian rug. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to match the devastating insult he had just delivered. People often mistake a lack of reaction for shock, but this was not shock. It was absolute, crystalline clarity. The quiet woman listened to the man she had loved for years reduce her to an opportunist, and the only physical movement she made was the slow, measured intake of a single breath. The air in the study tasted of aged leather and cold rain, slipping into her lungs and steadying her pulse. Instead of looking at the ultrasound file in his hands, Clara's gaze drifted just past her husband's shoulder. Hanging on the dark paneled wall behind him was a massive, brooding landscape painting. Damon had purchased it 2 years ago at a high society auction. He did not care about the artist's vision, the blending of the oils, or the quiet melancholy of the scenery. The wealthy patriarch had bought it simply because another executive had wanted it, and outbidding his rival had been a public demonstration of superior capital. He understood ownership. He understood control. He did not understand inherent value. As the quiet prosecution finished, she realized that his entire sense of security was tied to things he could purchase, intimidate, or lock away. He was incapable of comprehending a choice made out of unconditional care, just as he was incapable of understanding a choice made out of self-respect. If he believed she was trapping him, it was only because a trap was the only mechanism he used to keep people in his life. He was projecting his own transactional nature onto her. There was no need to scream, to weep, or to beg him to see the truth of who she was. Defending herself would imply that his judgment held weight, that his perception of her mattered. It no longer did. The insult did not pierce her heart because she had already packed away the emotional space where he used to reside. She stood before him, bathed in the dim golden light of the study, entirely detached from his paranoia. The silence she offered in return to his grand accusation was not a surrender. It was an impenetrable fortress. She watched him wait for her to break, knowing that the only thing truly trapped in this room was him. Instead of answering his paranoid claims, she simply turned away from him. Her footsteps were quiet, forming a soft rhythm against the thick weave of the Persian rug. The study was heavily shadowed, smelling of aged cedar, expensive leather, and the cold rain beating against the panoramic window panes. She walked toward the antique secretary desk, tucked into the far corner of the room. For years, it had been the silent command center where she managed the invisible architecture of his life, balancing the charity ledgers and handling the endless logistical demands of the Moretti legacy while he conquered boardrooms. She opened the bottom drawer. The glide of the wood was smooth, familiar, and well-oiled. She lifted the relocation folder. It was a thick, cream-colored document holder, entirely ordinary in its appearance, yet it carried the weight of a concluded era. Clara turned back. Damon stood behind his massive executive desk, his posture rigid. He was a man braced for the loud theatrics of a woman caught in a scheme, anticipating a tearful denial. She offered him none of it. Moving back into the pool of yellow light cast by the brass reading lamp, Clara stopped directly across from him. She lowered the relocation folder onto the polished mahogany surface. It landed with a soft, definitive thud, obscuring the financial reports he had been scrutinizing earlier. Then, she pressed the pad of her index finger against the cream cardstock. She slid the folder forward across the dark wood until it rested exactly halfway between them. Her touch was light, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. There was no tremor in her hand, no hesitation in her wrist. She did not flinch away from his imposing physical presence or the dangerous coldness pooling in his eyes. For years, she had handed him documents with gentle warmth, ensuring every file was arranged to ease his burden. Now, the presentation of this folder carried the sterile, precise energy of a professional handover. It was not a dramatic reveal. It was a resignation. She withdrew her hand, letting her arm fall to her side. She simply stood there, watching him with calm eyes, waiting for him to read the architecture of her exit. Damon stared down at the pristine cover of the relocation folder. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. He assumed, with the absolute certainty of a man who believed everyone had a price, that he knew exactly what was inside. He expected leverage. He anticipated a list of exorbitant financial demands, a proposed trust fund for the unborn child, and legal stipulations designed to secure her elevation within his family hierarchy. That was how his world worked. That was the exact nature of the trap he had just accused her of setting. With a slow, calculated motion, he reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. The first document was not a demand for his wealth. It was a standard residential lease agreement. Damon's eyes dragged across the text. The property was a small coastal cottage in Maine, hundreds of miles away from the towering glass and iron gates of the Moretti estate. The monthly rent was modest, drawn from an independent account he did not recognize, but it was not the remote location that froze the breath in his lungs. It was the bottom of the page. His gaze dropped to the signature line. Clara's name was written in her neat, flowing script, right beside the stark black stamp of a public notary. He looked at the date. He blinked, the ambient noise of the storm outside seemingly cutting out entirely. He reached across the desk and pulled the ultrasound file from Dr. Eris closer, placing it directly beside the lease. The date on the ultrasound file was exactly 2 weeks ago. The notarized date on the lease agreement was 6 weeks ago. A cold, heavy sensation began to spread through the center of his chest. He turned the page of the lease, his fingers suddenly feeling thick and numb against the paper. Beneath the housing contract lay a formal divorce petition. It was fully completed, lacking only his signature. He checked the date beside her gold-nibbed signature. It perfectly matched the lease. The timeline was indisputable. It was written in clinical, unforgiving ink. She had not plotted to use a child to anchor herself to his empire. She had finalized her escape long before the pregnancy was ever confirmed. She had secured an independent roof and severed her legal ties to his name, while she still believed she was entirely alone. Damon stared at the two contrasting dates until the numbers seemed to blur into the cardstock. The elaborate, cynical narrative he had just constructed, the accusation of a calculated trap, disintegrated in an instant. The physical evidence completely dismantled his pride. It proved that his wealth, his status, and his formidable reputation had not been enough to keep her. In fact, they were the very things she was quietly walking away from. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that Clara had been perfectly willing to raise his child in a small seaside cottage, completely devoid of his money, his protection, and his presence. He had always believed she needed his name to survive. He was wrong. The silence in the mahogany-lined study shifted. It was no longer a weapon he wielded to intimidate her. It had become a massive, echoing void, swallowing the last remnants of his control. The heavy silence of the study settled over the mahogany desk like a shroud. The amber glow of the brass lamp illuminated the crisp black ink on the cream-colored pages, casting long shadows across the polished wood. The man who had spent his entire life anticipating betrayals and deciphering hidden motives now found himself completely paralyzed by a simple, undeniable timeline. Damon stared at the documents spread out before him. The narrative he had built in his mind, the paranoid certainty that his wife was using a child to cement her status within the Moretti empire, began to fracture under the weight of clinical dates. His eyes darted between the stamped ultrasound file and the papers resting inside the relocation folder. The medical scan, confirming the early pregnancy, bore a timestamp from just 2 weeks ago. but the long-term lease agreement for a coastal property in Maine, neatly signed at the bottom in her elegant script, was dated 6 weeks prior. Beneath it lay the drafted divorce petition, bearing the exact same older calendar mark. He touched the edge of the heavy paper, his fingers tracing the typed numbers as if expecting the ink to smudge, hoping to uncover a typographical error or a clumsy forgery. There was no flaw to be found. The math refused to bend to his pride. He had accused her of anchoring herself to his wealth, of using the unborn child as permanent leverage. The stark reality printed on the page proved she had already cut the anchor line long before the infant even existed. His thumb hovered over the date, October 14th. The specific day mocked him, rising from the page to strike at his memory with absolute precision. That was the week he had flown to Chicago for a crucial logistics acquisition, leaving her entirely alone in the sprawling Rhode Island mansion. He had not called. He had not sent a single message. He had simply assumed she would remain in her designated place, a quiet, dependable fixture waiting in the background of his life until he required her presence. Instead, while he was managing shipping routes and corporate power plays, she had been sitting across from a lawyer, calmly and methodically dismantling the architecture of their marriage. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The leather of his executive chair groaned slightly as he shifted his weight, suddenly feeling the immense, crushing gravity of his own neglect. The defeat of the powerful Mafia boss did not come from a rival family or a severed contract. It arrived through a simple, unarguable timeline. The accusation of a trap crumbled into dust, leaving behind nothing but the hollow realization of his complete loss. There had never been a trap. There was only a woman who had recognized her own worth, and an open door he had been too blind to notice she was walking through. The quiet in the room stretched out, thin and fragile like a layer of morning frost. Clara watched him process the dates, her posture relaxed and entirely devoid of the rigid defense expected of someone falsely accused. She did not cross her arms. She did not demand an apology for the insults he had hurled at her only moments before. Anger required hope, and she had exhausted her reserves of both a long time ago. Slowly, she lifted her left hand. The ambient light of the study caught the edge of her platinum band. It had always been a heavy piece of jewelry, selected by her husband not for its subtle beauty, but for its undeniable statement of ownership. It was a ring meant to be noticed from across a crowded room. A warning to others and a heavy crown for the wife of a man who equated control with devotion. Her fingers brushed the cool metal. It slipped off her knuckle with effortless ease, proving just how little weight a symbol carried when the heart beneath it had already departed. She extended her arm and placed the ring directly on top of the relocation folder. Clink. The metallic sound was shockingly loud against the quiet backdrop of the study. It vibrated against the wood, a small, sharp note of finality that she allowed to linger in the air. Leaving the ring was not an act of spite, nor was it a dramatic declaration of war. It was merely the quiet return of a borrowed title she no longer had any use for. The metal sitting on the paperwork was not a demand for better terms or a cry for attention. It was a receipt for a transaction that had already closed. She had looked at the immense wealth, the status, and the fearful respect that came with his name, and decided that a solitary life on a remote coast was infinitely more valuable. The Mafia boss remained frozen in his chair, reigning over an empire of marble and glass, staring at the small circle of platinum that proved he had already lost, the only thing he had forgotten to protect. By dawn, the fog rolling off the Newport cliffs clung to the wrought iron gates of the Moretti estate. Clara walked down the sweeping limestone steps with measured precision. She carried only a single leather suitcase. The heavy oak doors had closed behind her with a soft, final click, echoing briefly in the damp air. The sprawling mansion behind her stood like a silent mausoleum in the pale morning light. The gravel crunched steadily beneath her flat shoes. The sound was the only disruption in the otherwise still atmosphere. There was no screaming match echoing from the grand balconies, no security team rushing out to block her path. She had walked past the night guards with a calm nod, and they had simply lowered their eyes, unsure of how to handle a departure that carried no threat, no panic, and no stolen assets. Leaving begins quietly. It ends the exact same way. At the base of the driveway, past the towering hedgerow, a modest sedan idled softly in the mist. The headlights cut through the gray morning, casting a warm yellow glow against the damp pavement. Elena stood leaning against the passenger side door, the collar of her wool coat turned up against the chill. She did not ask if Clara was sure. She did not look toward the imposing estate looming in the background. Her sister simply stepped forward, took the luggage, and lifted it easily into the trunk. The latch closed with a dull, ordinary thud. Clara opened the passenger door and slid into the seat. The interior of the car smelled faintly of worn fabric, old coffee, and the lavender heating vent. It was small. It lacked the quiet hum of a reinforced engine or the scent of custom Italian leather that defined Damon's fleet of armored vehicles. Yet, as the heater blew warm air across her frozen fingers, the narrow space felt infinitely safer than the sprawling glass corridors she had abandoned. Elena put the car into gear. "The heater takes a minute to really get going," she murmured. "It is already warm enough," Clara answered softly. The sedan pulled away from the curb, its tires rolling smoothly over the wet asphalt. The wrought iron gates faded into the rearview mirror, swallowed by the thick ocean fog. Clara did not turn her head to watch the stone architecture disappear. She kept her eyes focused forward, watching the condensation gather on the windshield. She was not a fugitive running from a dangerous syndicate. She was a woman who had legally, methodically, and permanently severed the anchor that had been dragging her under. The road ahead was completely empty. It did not feel like an escape. It simply felt like an open horizon. Back inside the darkened mahogany study, the silence of the house had begun to settle, pressing against the walls like a physical weight. Damon sat perfectly still behind his expansive desk. The only source of light was a single brass reading lamp, its beam illuminating the objects left behind. The platinum band rested precisely on the center of the cream-colored relocation folder. It did not catch the light. It lay there, heavy, dull, and entirely motionless. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the cold metal before drifting down to the edge of the paperwork. Damon traced the edge of the notarized stamp on the lease agreement. The ink was dark, permanent, and undeniable. The date mocked him in its absolute clarity. He dragged his thumb across the numbers, as if the friction might somehow erase the chronological truth. It did not. The paperwork confirmed exactly what his pride had tried to deny. For years, the man had operated under the assumption that his empire was a fortress. He believed his vast wealth and the inherited power created a cage so comfortable that no one would voluntarily leave it. He had accused his wife of orchestrating a pregnancy trap because, in his world, people fought brutally for a fraction of his assets. The idea that someone would actively plan to walk away from his money to raise a child in a modest coastal cottage was incomprehensible. Until now. Damon shifted his gaze from the lease contract to the divorce petition underneath it. The gold-nibbed pen she had used to sign the document had left a slight indentation on the heavy paper. She had not asked for alimony. She had not demanded a settlement, a trust fund, or a piece of the corporate holdings. Every line regarding financial support had been cleanly crossed out. The realization moved through the room slowly, chilling the air. His power held absolutely no value to her. He could command boardrooms and orchestrate the destruction of rival syndicates. He released his grip on the desk, his hand falling limply to his lap. The house around him felt entirely different now. The absence of the soft hum of her presence, the missing scent of her evening tea, the absolute lack of her footsteps in the hallway above, it all amplified the hollow vastness of the estate. He had successfully protected his wealth from a trap that never existed. In doing so, he had engineered his own complete isolation. Damon closed his eyes, the heavy silence finally swallowing him whole. 4 months later, the high-stakes boardroom atop the Moretti corporate tower felt entirely different. It was still lined with dark walnut paneling and flanked by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a conquering, unobstructed view of the city. Yet, the altitude no longer felt like a triumph to Damon. He sat at the head of the massive table. 3 of his top vice presidents sat across from him, sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio forward across the polished wood. It was a lucrative logistics acquisition. Months of ruthless, calculated negotiation had culminated in this final morning. All that remained was his authorization. Beside his right hand, resting directly on the bare mahogany, rather than locked away in the estate's impenetrable steel vault, sat Clara's platinum band. He had carried it with him every day since she left. He refused to hide it. The heavy circle of metal looked incredibly small next to the towering stacks of corporate leverage. The executives waited in respectful silence, their eyes carefully avoiding the ring. Damon uncapped his gold-nibbed pen. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet room. He lowered the fine tip toward the bottom of the thick paper. Then, his hand stopped. His eyes locked onto the top right corner of the document. The printed date glared back at him. The typed numbers instantly blurred, replaced in his mind by the black ink on Clara's relocation folder. Every time he looked at a corporate calendar, every time he saw a timestamp on a legal filing, the same crushing sequence resurfaced. He saw the exact week she had signed her lease in Maine. He saw the date on her divorce petition. Both of them stamped a full fortnight before Dr. Aris had recorded the ultrasound file. The contract beneath his hand promised him millions in new shipping routes. It meant absolutely nothing. He had spent his entire adult life accumulating leverage, assuming everyone could be bought, manipulated, or managed. He had accused his wife of using a child to secure a permanent financial position in his family. His jaw tightened, a sharp tension radiating through his chest. Clara had already structured her exit, prepared to raise his child entirely without his wealth, his protection, or his name. The silence in the room stretched too long. One of the men shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, clearing his throat. Damon did not look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the platinum band. It did not catch the gleam of the morning sun. It just sat there, heavy, dull, and abandoned. A man who controlled international supply chains could not command a quiet woman to stay in his house. The ultimate defense against a husband's suspicious pride was a quiet timeline that proved his wealth was never a reason for her to stay. Damon pressed the pen to the paper. He signed his name. He had everything he built, and nothing left to go home to. 400 miles north, the biting chill of the coastal winter had finally surrendered to a mild, sunlit spring. The small cottage in Maine stood on a gentle rise overlooking a quiet harbor. It was built of weathered cedar shingles, bordered by a wide, wraparound porch. There were no towering iron gates. There were no perimeter security teams patrolling the driveway. There were no marble floors that echoed with every footstep. There was only the rhythmic, endlessly vast sound of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the gray rocks below. Clara knelt in the soft, damp earth of her side garden. She wore a thick, cream-colored knit sweater and loose canvas trousers, her bare hands buried deep in the soil as she settled a row of young hydrangea cuttings into the ground. The smell of sea salt mixed with the rich, dark scent of turned dirt. She worked methodically. She pressed the roots deep, patting the earth down, ensuring the fragile foundation was secure. She did not need an army of landscapers to maintain her environment. She only needed her own hands and the patience to watch something grow at its own natural pace. A gentle ache settled in her lower back. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her wrist. She lowered her clean palm to rest against the undeniable, heavy curve of her stomach. A soft, distinct flutter moved beneath her skin. She smiled. The expression was completely unguarded. Her breathing remained slow and steady, untethered from any pressure to secure a bloodline or justify her existence through the birth of an heir. She was simply a mother sitting in the sun. She looked out toward the open horizon. The water was a calm, reflective silver under the late morning light. We often accuse others of the traps we have built ourselves. Damon had looked at her with such intense, suspicious eyes, truly believing her pregnancy was a calculated chain forged to hold him. He had never understood the simplest truth of their marriage. The cage was already open, long before the bird finally flew. She picked up her metal watering can, the cool handle familiar and grounding against her palm. She did not look back at the memories of an iron estate. The future did not feel like a cage anymore. It felt like an open road. Empires are built from stone, money, and ambition. Homes are built from something else entirely. Clara stood up, taking a slow, deep breath of the ocean air, quietly walking forward at her own chosen pace.